Good day from CSG headquarters in Lexington, Kentucky. I'm Sean Sloan, Senior Policy Analyst at the Council of State Governments, and I staff the What's Next Leveraging Innovation Subcommittee of CSG's Healthy States National Task Force. One of the policy areas the subcommittee is focused on is artificial intelligence in the healthcare sector. And one of the areas a number of states have begun to look at is whether there is a need for regulation and or oversight of the development of AI. I'm talking today with Eugene Santos Jr., a professor of engineering at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, who has specialized in artificial intelligence as a researcher and technologist, publishing more than 200 articles on the subject. He also recently served as a member of the state of Vermont's Artificial Intelligence Task Force, which issued its final report in January. Dr. Santos, welcome. How did the task force's report speak to the issue of state regulation of AI?
First, thank you for having me here. So the task force's goal in terms of AI for the state was to examine and figure out what the current AI usage is in the state and also project where it might go. Also at the same time was to address a slew of factors such as impact on economy, impact on jobs, both positive and negative, and as well as provide a feeling of what the perception of AI is in the state of Vermont itself.
The first recommendation, though, speaks specifically to regulation and says that the task force does not recommend the promulgation of new specific state regulations of AI at this time. So did the task force contemplate that there might be a need for a more active role for state government at some point down the road?
Yes, it did. So our decision at that point was we didn't have enough information given just the task force and what we're currently studying. And our conclusion is that we needed a longer term committee, something that could also delve more deeply into different areas that might look at regulation.
Yeah, and the task force also recommended the establishment of a permanent artificial intelligence commission. What role did the task force feel such a commission could play?
I think we felt it was going to be a very central role. That is looking at the different ways AI can come into Vermont itself. And then they can study it deeply enough, have the authority to either, of course, recommend regulations directly to the government, or possibly, depending upon what the state of Vermont wants to do, actually even establish regulations. So it was pretty much the gamut, but it's something that we all felt needed for the long term.
Yeah. The task force also recommended adoption of an AI code of ethics. And, we've also seen any number of organizations and companies and experts sort of speak to this idea of the need for guidelines for the development of ethical AI. So what is that? And what did the task force, why did the task force believe that a code of ethics would be necessary?
Well, it actually covers a broad base of things. And so I'm just going to talk from my point of view mostly first. And so we needed the ethics to make sure people are thinking about where their AI might be applied and who it might affect. Plus, also just general guidelines is that, hey, make sure you do think through this. If you're going to use your AI, make sure that, you understand who it's going to impact. And so the guideline of ethics, the ones that we chose, it's not that we didn't want to reinvent the wheel necessarily. So we adopted the guidelines from many sources, of which the primary one was the EU, of course, who's been studying, or they've been studying, of course, AI in the broader sense as well. So these guidelines, I think, it's going to also, come down to a lot of different elements of potentially even stating policy as well as determining, I would say, future regulations and, future, laws and policies as well.
Mm-hmm. In addition, the task force recommended looking at business and economic growth incentives, increased education and outreach programs, and efforts to retrain and reskill workers. So obviously there was a clear interest in what AI will mean to the state's economy and its workforce in the years ahead and things like that. What can you tell us about those recommendations?
Yeah, those recommendations were both looking at now, which in the state of Vermont, there isn't as much AI yet, but trying to figure out how it should grow and one thing I'll point out, and this was one of my particular interests, is that what does Vermont aspire AI technology to do? So it was a way of looking at the long term. So defining the pieces, such as the education piece, is to help people understand AI. The business incentives would be things like, oh, the state of Vermont, we have these resources to help you develop AI technology potentially, to help you figure out what the right way of fielding AI technology is, as well as the right way of evaluating and assessing how should your AI technology be used.
Mm-hmm. So Vermont is, I think, the first, or if not the first, certainly one of the first states to complete this sort of a task force process on artificial intelligence. Are the Vermont task force's recommendations and the experiences that you all had sort of applicable as other states work to look at these issues around AI?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, what we went through, I think majority of the other states and organizations will also have to go through the same thing, and just getting the landscape. The only differences would be, of course, to remember that Vermont is a small state, also a highly rural state, has different characteristics and demographics. So each of the other states that decide to go forward, and there's already a couple, hopefully they're, of course, taking those into consideration. The one thing I would strongly recommend, if the other states that are going to put together a task force, is to follow the diversity of the members of the task force we had. We had members from across the range of society, not just technologists like myself, but people from the social workers community, people from the ACLU, retired judges. That is very important. I actually found that that was probably the biggest benefit, to just understand the lay of the land and what people thought about it from different perspectives.
Yeah. So, do you think that there are some states for whom it might make sense to sort of go a different route in terms of the level of regulation that it might make sense to take with regards to AI that maybe Vermont didn't necessarily feel comfortable with, but another state might have a more hands-on approach?
Well, I think certainly, because each state is very different, and also, kind of the obvious ones are like the states of California, Washington, the high-tech states already, where they're having a boom in AI technologies. The danger, of course, is that in a way they might be struggling to keep up with the AI impact that's going on. So, those are sometimes where you might have to come down to regulations, and we're seeing them, right? The banning of facial recognition technology. While I don't 100% agree with that, because it's not about banning a specific technology, but more of how it's actually being applied, well, I mean, if things are getting out of control, you have to start somewhere potentially.
Right. Uh, AI has obviously applications across a number of different sectors of American life, and you mentioned one just there. And our subcommittee is specifically focused on AI in the medical field. So, did those
Mhm.
applications come up specifically as part of the Vermont Task Force process and discussions?
Right, it actually did. The task force, we were asked to look across all spectrums of all industries, as much as we can at least. So I was actually tasked to look at healthcare as one of the industries, as well as the insurance industries, and for Vermont to see what's going on there. And part of it is that Vermont doesn't have much applications in healthcare, but the experts that we talked to felt that it was coming down the line. So, for example, there was already FDA approved, how should I say, AI algorithms and AI devices to make diagnosis, such as neuropathy by examining the eye and such like that. And these are going to have big impacts. Now, again, for Vermont, these are not deployed yet, but the report was to look at what is going to come and what do we have to worry about. And I don't want to say worry is too negative. What do we have to consider? Because there's a lot of benefits and, of course, the risks that come with them.
Yeah. You wrote an op-ed for the Hill newspaper in D.C. last year, and what you wrote was that those in the AI profession, together with consumers of AI, need to establish a framework of guardrails for self-oversight of AI technologies, addressing intended outcomes and unintended consequences by first establishing concrete principles on creating AI-driven technologies adhering to such guardrails. You write that we can potentially use our existing medical framework as a starting point. So how might that provide a good starting point for everything else we think about with AI?
Well, I actually think that on the medical side, there's a lot of checks and balances and a lot of reasoning and thought that's been done for their framework. For example, just simply how do you release a drug? What are the off-label uses that are permissible for a drug? That's been thought about for a long time. And I think this is something that AI needs to make sure of. You can imagine that a lot of AI that's going on out there might be even considered off-label use because people are applying without necessarily thinking about it. So as a start, that's why I think at least the framework like the FDA might provide us the skeleton framework to ask questions about AI and how to manage them properly.
Right. You also write that the next step is getting both the AI creators and AI users to think hard about such guardrails even before attempting to build new technologies embedded with AI. Is that happening now, or are there sort of AI-enabled products coming to market without that understanding of what those guardrails need to be?
I actually believe there's a lot of products coming to market, the latter that you just pointed out. People haven't thought through what they're releasing. People haven't thought through, the impacts that it have. While this example is not in the United States, you can imagine, again, this is one of the uproars behind facial recognition technology, where facial recognition technology was deployed, for example, to identify, people who might be LBGT, identify, people who might be considered criminals. And there are so many examples of that where people just went ahead and released it. These are things that I'm just not thinking through of, is your system even working right? Which of course is a completely different issue too.
Finally, I wanted to ask you about this idea of algorithmic bias, an issue that we read a great deal about these days with regards to AI. And as we think about AI in medicine, is there a way that states or the powers that be, whoever, can help to ensure that the algorithms that drive AI don't end up baking in the biases that we have as humans, and help ensure that AI does not exacerbate inequities in healthcare or contribute to some of the trends that may already be causing problems in medicine?
Well, there's two things here. One is for AI itself, it's nascent work right now, but there's work in, of course, trying to figure out statistically, mathematically, or through computer algorithms themselves to figure out how biased an algorithm might be. So you can imagine that if an AI algorithm comes up with this answer, one of the things to say is that, well, what's driving this answer? And of course, that's also part of the explainable AI movement that I believe that we should be moving towards. But the other piece is this, sort of these baked-in biases. There's an element on the human side as well. I think each one of us, by nature, have our own biases that we're not aware of. So part of the things that can help is that, how do we handle that? How do we handle, for example, a doctor who might be biased? How do you expose that bias? I mean, usually requires another human or an organization to help, set the bias apart or, repair the bias and go forward. So it's gonna be a mix of the two. And still, though, one of the things that with the, how should I say, the bias that's studied from the algorithms, when we can combine the two, I think we will get a much better understanding of bias, both on the human and the computer side.
Great. Well, Dr. Santos, I want to thank you again for joining us today and providing your perspective, which will help greatly to inform the work of our subcommittee and task force. I'm Sean Sloan at CSG headquarters in Lexington. Thank you.